Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Scrutiny Board for Environment, Housing and Communities. My name is Councillor Stuart Galton. I'm chairing the meeting today, and we are going to introduce the other members of the board.
Thank you very much, Chair. Councillor Annan for heading the High Park.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Javed Akhtar, Councillor for Little London and Woodhouse Ward.
Morning, everyone. I'm Councillor Andy Rontruth from Kirkstall Ward.
Good morning, folks. Councillor Adrian McCluskey, Farnley and Wortley Ward.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Councillor Penny Stables from Wetherby Ward.
Good morning, Councillor Simon Seary from the Pudsey Ward.
Good morning, Councillor Norma Harrington from Wetherby Ward.
Morning. Morning, Councillor Barry Anderson, Adland Wharfdale Ward, coughing.
Thank you. We also have apologies today from Councillor Pauline Graham, and handing over to Becky Atherton to introduce herself and her role.
Becky Atherton, Principal Scrutiny Advisor.
Thank you. Let's go through the agenda. So, first of all, appeals against refusal of inspection of documents.
There are no appeals against refusal of inspection documents.
Item 2, items of exclusion.
There are no items excluded from the public domain today, Chair.
Any late items of business?
No late items, Chair.
4, declarations of interest. Councillor Harrington.
Can I declare that I'm a trustee of Wetherby and Sports of the Elderly WISE, which is a third sector organisation. It's a non-pecuniary interest, so I don't think there's any reason why I shouldn't be involved in discussions.
I'd like to declare an interest. I'm on the board of Voluntary Action Leeds for a later item. That's all the declarations. We've done apologies, I beg your pardon. And we shall now go on to item 6, which is the minutes of the last meeting. Becky.
Thank you, Chair. It's just to note that in relation to minutes 76 and 77, the responsible 5 scrutiny boards of the budget proposals was submitted to Exec Board on the 7th of February as required and was included in the document pack submitted to Council yesterday. Otherwise, we're just seeking approval of the minutes from the 25th of January as a correct record.
Oh, thank you, Becky. And for the benefit of board members, I have contacted John Woolmer in Waste, as there was an item presented at the budget yesterday which wasn't presented to us as a scrutiny board to scrutinise prior to being proposed. So I've asked for detail on that policy to be provided for board members so that we can catch up at speed. On to item 7, housing activity update. We have several guests with us today. First of all, big welcome to Dennis Moody, who arrived very early for the meeting. We appreciate that. If only I could match that consistency myself. Councillor Jess Lennox, who is the Executive Board member. James Rogers, the Director. Mandy Sawyer, who is Head of Housing and Neighbourhood Services, and Adam Crampton. However, I believe there are other members present. And if they'd like to introduce themselves, that'd be very useful.
Good morning. I'm Craig Simpson, Head of Leeds Building Services.
Hi, I'm Kerry Murray, Head of Homelessness Services.
Thank you. You're both very welcome. Can I now hand over to Councillor Lennox to introduce the item?
Morning. I'm just actually going to hand straight over to Mandy to introduce the item, and then we'll pick everything up at the end.
Okay, so apologies. The report covers the main areas of work from across Housing Leeds over recent months. The report outlines that there's been improvements across all of our main KPIs over recent months. rent collection, voids and repairs, particularly we've seen improvements. And I think for many of those areas, we are seeing performance either returning to or close to pre-COVID levels, which is really positive. I think since the report was written, we've continued to see performance improvements and working really closely as a service to ensure that we're driving down and improving performance on an ongoing basis. The report also outlines a number of significant changes that are a big priority for us as a service. There's an awful lot going on as a housing sector, and so a lot of that is driving our strategic priorities as a service. So damp and mould has been a priority of the service for quite some time now, and is really quite well established now in terms of the work that we've done to respond to the increase in the number of damp and mould reports. So we've got the damp and mould team and the proactive tenant communications campaign in place, and we've done extensive training with staff. There's also ongoing work with the decarbonisation agenda and helping to deliver investment programmes around heating and insulation, and that's outlined within the report. The introduction of the Building Safety Act has introduced additional requirements on us as a landlord to ensure building safety. So there's an update within the report around that, but a big focus of that is around sharing information with tenants so that tenants are able to see that we are managing building safety within those high-risk blocks. There's also an update in terms of the REMA programme and the 11 blocks that have been identified for rehousing residents and demolition. And then also in relation to the increased pressures on homelessness and updates on what we're doing in response to that, and also the demands, the pressure on demand for council housing. And you're aware, we've recently started consultation on proposed changes to our lettings policy, for which we had a workshop with the Scrutiny Board last month. And then finally, I suppose the introduction of social housing regulation is a massive priority for us currently, with the requirement to report against a new national suite of tenant satisfaction measures, which we reported to Scrutiny Board last month. And then a strengthened requirement for us to evidence that we've comply with the regulator's consumer standards. But there's an awful lot of sort of new guidance, new consultation documents that are coming out almost on a weekly basis from the regulator. So it's very much about us responding to that to make sure that we've got a robust response in Leeds. So that's a high level introduction to the report. I don't know, Councillor, if you want to go through it sort of area by area, or do you want to sort of open it up for questions at that point?
Yes, thank you. We will be going through it area by area because I know this is an area that members have got a keen interest in several aspects of it. But before we do so, though, Mr. Moody's joined us today. He's very welcome. I just wanted to understand if the Tenants Scrutiny Board had any particular issues that they were going to look into this year that you might want to inform the Scrutiny Board about, so that we can hopefully work together.
The one that we've looked into so far is damp and mould, and we've put 11 recommendations through, which the council has accepted. We are meeting on the 29th of this month to look at other alternatives, other projects, which we will inform you once we get to know which ones we're going to deal with.
Thank you. We look forward to that. We really value your contribution. So on to the agenda. The first item in the report is around rent collection. Members, questions? Councillor Stables.
Looking at section B on here, and you talk about being supportive in terms of residents who are struggling to pay their rents. I just wondered if you can outline the process that takes place when tenants aren't able to pay their rents?
Okay, so there's arrears procedure that we follow, and that involves a series of letters that are part of the formal process. And as part of that formal process, there are certain criteria that we're required to inform the tenant in terms of risk of losing your home, which is complemented. So while we do that more enforcement approach, alongside that, we very much manage communication by phone, by email, by text, very much wanting to have a conversation with the customer before we apply that procedure. It's only really once we are not able to manage that contact and so come to some form of agreement or arrangement around any arrears payments that we would look to apply that process. There is a national pre-court protocol, which is a national criteria which all landlords are required to comply with to ensure that we are offering that supportive approach before we look at any kind of enforcement action against someone.
Chair, can I just have a follow-up question?
Yes, sir.
So what happens, what's kind of the next stage? I want to find out sort of what happens if they are unable to pay. What happens to that person?
So we have 10 housing officers income, and they are dedicated officers who are able to provide that more specialist support in terms of they'll do an income and expenditure analysis with the individual, identify what their benefit entitlements are and what opportunities there may be to maximise income. So that is outlined within the paragraph 2. So that we supported during 23-24, we've supported 3,600 households, and the impact of that has been really quite significant, with an average of £629 per month per household in terms of additional income that's been generated.
Sorry, apologies. I just want to kind of go beyond that. So I understand all that, and which looks really good. I'm just wondering, are there presumably are circumstances in which you don't come to an agreement, and therefore you have to bring in enforcement? What happens beyond that point? So they become homeless. Do we support as a council? What actually happens to that person?
Okay, so we have a paralegal team who they coordinate that court process. As part of that court process, there's a really close working relationship with Leeds Housing Options. So we would always have a conversation with Leeds Housing Options in terms of trying to prevent the homelessness, because obviously there are funds, there are support mechanisms from within Leeds Housing Options. But also beyond that, if we know the family have got engagement with social workers, a care worker, a support worker, we will always try to engage with them and take sort of more of a case conference approach, so that we are as much as possible trying to prevent evictions. I mean, we only evicted 28, but for rent arrears, we evicted 24 households in 22-23. So that really highlights that is absolute last resort.
Thanks very much. We finished on the rent. Shall we move on to voids performance? Members, Councillor Anderson.
Talking specifically about houses here, I want to talk about garages. Bearing in mind the financial constraints the council have got, I think this is a good avenue for bringing them back in again. Now, there's two ways you can do that. One is you can bring them back in as is, but I would have thought the state of some of the garages might preclude some of that from being brought back in again. So I think we need a wholesale plan about demolishing some of the garages, refurbishing some, and then re-let them out at more realistic rents than you're currently charging them out at the moment. So what can we do to try and bring some of them back in again, and a long-term strategy for demolishing, repairing, or whatever it is that you need to do?
Yeah, excuse me. Yes, thank you, Councillor. The wider strategy around garages is in development. You'll be aware that demand for garages does vary depending on location and variables of that nature. There are a number of options appraisals taking place around some specific garage sites at the moment. What the most appropriate route for those garage sites is. Some of them do require investment, but equally, does that investment represent value for money in the longer term based on, like I say, the demand in that particular area, for example. So we do have some targeted options appraisals taking place, but that wider strategy is also in development across the entirety of the garage estate. Sorry, can I come in just for a second? Would you be able to be doing that review on a ward by ward basis so that local councillor insight into individual locations could be taken into consideration? Absolutely, Councillor. And where the individual options appraisals take place, consultation with local members absolutely is a part of that process. But certainly the wider strategy we'll have to consult on a ward by ward basis. Councillor Harrington.
It was largely what you just said, Chair, but it's really about, is there any way that we can be informed as ward members how many garages there are in each ward, how many are actually let at the moment, and how many you cannot let because of the disrepair that they're in currently? Because I know in my ward that there are several people, not council tenants necessarily, but several people who would be willing to rent garages, but they can't get hold of them. Thank you.
Obviously, I don't have that information available immediately, but can certainly get that information to you, Councillor. Yep. Thank you, Councillor Khan.
Thank you, Chair. Just following from Councillor Barry Anderson's point, can you tell me how many void properties we have in across our stock, and what is the timescale for those properties to be brought back into use?
Yes, certainly. Thank you, Councillor. At the time of the report, there was 700 empty homes across the stock, which equates to 1.35% of our stock. That's improved slightly since the report was written to 669 as of yesterday, representing 1.29% of our stock. Our target is, of course, 1%. We've consistently referred to that target at this meeting and others. There have been significant improvements since the peak of the void position in December 23. So 12 months ago, we were at 940, 1.82% of stock. So we have consistently seen over the last 2 years, reductions in the overall number of void properties. Obviously, since it peaked at the end of the pandemic. We are seeing week on week those net reductions in the number of empty properties. We average around this financial year, around 53 new voids on a weekly basis. So obviously we're looking for those net reductions to achieve that 1% target. As we get closer to it, it does become more challenging. But we are working towards that 1% target and currently at 1.29% at 669 empty properties. Councillor Lennox.
Thank you. I think just to point out about the 1% target, we want there to be void properties. We want people to be moving through our properties. We want people to be housed in the correct, in the correct properties for them, which means that people will be moving out of our properties, new people will be moving. So there'll always be a number of voids. I think another thing just to say is the void numbers have been tumbling down since I took on this portfolio last summer. It was a lot higher. And that's despite the fact that we've had so many more of our new build houses come online. So obviously, whenever we put someone in a new house, that voids a property. We've had 60 flats at Middleton, at Gascoigne House, plus all of the other family homes there. We've had houses come online in Seacroft. So as we are building houses and getting them online, there's periods of time when those houses, when people are moving into those houses, where the voids will jump up because at any time maybe 10 to 15 to 20 or more of our tenants will be moving to one of those new houses, or people on our list will move into one of those new houses, which spikes the numbers of voids. So the trajectory and the trend is what is important. And I can assure everybody we have the like I say, it's tumbled down since earlier in the summer. So it's really good work that I'd like to thank the team for.
Thank you, Councillor Lennox. Councillor Actor.
Chair, really, I'll raise this because Barry has just raised about the garages, but I'll come back to it on the asset management. But what policy have we got in place with the blocks, especially high-rise blocks, and the car ownership? Because we represent an area which is part of the city centre, and the parking is the biggest problem. And those garages those we have, they're not used. But I'll come back to the asset management. But the question is, what policy have we got in place before we offer a flat to an applicant? But however, if they are ownership of a car, and we already know there is a lack of facilities for car parking, so what we got in place for that particular policy?
We don't take into consideration car ownership in allocating our properties. All allocations are made in accordance with our lettings policy, which is very much based on need of the individual.
Chair, I'm absolutely aware that these blocks were not designed for the car ownership. When there is only a space available for 20 cars, and there are 99 flats, and each flat has like 2 cars, and then there are permanent zone areas where people cannot park their vehicles, is causing a lot of problem for city areas like my ward, for example. So isn't it a time that we should have some sort of policy in place where we encourage to have less cars in those areas, but have a mixture of everything? I mean, for example, typical example is someone moves into a black block in a flat, single person, 1 bedroom, gets married, comes 2 of them, give them another couple of years, a child, give them a next 10 years down the road, they've got 3 people in the family and 2 cars. But unfortunately, the capacity that we've got available is not suitable. And that's what the problem is in ward like ours. I think it's something that we need to consider when we do offer people a flat in those areas, and to have that question put in to say, do you own a car? Because we don't have a space for you to park that car there.
Thank you, Councillor. I think we're going into an area which isn't strictly under the jurisdiction of housing, but it certainly brings to mind that a parking strategy might be something that we might want to look into, whether that's in a council housing aspect or generally. But that would cause difficulty, wouldn't it? If we ask people about whether they owned a car, because they might feel that coloured whether or not they were able to get to the property in the first place, as opposed to the need. So I'll leave that with you. So, Councillor Harrington.
Thank you, Chair. On voids, I'd like to know if we can get a list of per ward, how many have been empty for 6 months or more, and how many are currently empty, because I'm quite aware of at least one in my ward that's been empty for more than 12 months. And I get a lot of complaints from residents saying, why is nobody doing anything about it? So that would be really helpful if we could have a breakdown per ward, please. Today, obviously.
Councillor Anderson.
It was on a similar point. I don't know how the new computer system that we got into housing, whether it could give us as councillors a breakdown of the individual houses as to what's happening, because I get people contacting me saying, I need a house. I've been walking around, in my case, the Holtdales, and I've noticed this house is empty, that house is empty. When's it due to come up onto the market, or what's the reason for it's not? Now, in some cases, it's because the tenant that was in there previously didn't leave it in a very usable condition, right? Sometimes it's maybe due to the system not working properly, but is there any way that you could get a printout to us easily without taking up too much of the housing manager's time to let us know what the position is with these houses? And we can then at least help residents and say, look, it's going to be another 2 months before this one's probably going to come on the market. So you either need to hold off or applying for other houses to give them a realistic expectation.
We can certainly provide that, councillor. It does require some manual intervention, but certainly something that we can produce with target timescales for when we anticipate that those properties will be ready to let. How the process effectively works is when a property comes into void, obviously we survey that property, establish what work needs to be undertaken. That work is then subsequently undertaken, and then as we get towards the end of that process, liaising very closely with colleagues in housing management to ensure there's no downtime between the property being ready to let and then indeed let. So yeah, we can absolutely provide that on a ward by ward basis.
Thank you, Councillor Tudor.
Good morning, and apologies for being slightly late. Yeah, two things quickly. If it is expensive to refurbish garages, we get a lot of people saying, oh, we just need more parking space. Where am I supposed to put my 4 cars in this street that was built in the 1960s? So what about on some of this housing land, making allocated parking spaces with that we can rent with those posts that, like they have in the city centre, rather than building more repairing garages. The other thing, just on housing stock, very different point. One of my predecessors in my area said that in his view, housing managers should be allowed to do more managing, and gave the idea of one empty property can sometimes solve up to 5 households' needs of moving. That's all I would do at this moment to pass that forward. Is clearly a massive question about which I have really yet no understanding. So I'm not criticising anything in particular at the moment, but just raising it.
And just to clarify, I think that's a frustration held by many members. Councillor Rowntree.
Thank you, Chair. Going back to voids, I'm wondering if you're able to give an indication of what are the most common reasons why properties remain void for longer than we might wish. I mean, I totally understand that a certain level of void property has to be maintained so that there can be continual moving, but what are the factors that mean it's taking longer than is desirable, and what can we do to address that, do you think? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, councillor. As I'm sure you'd anticipate, there's an awfully high number of variables that do come into play when we're talking about the work that's required in void. Not least elements such as obviously property condition. Clearing voids and clearing gardens is a big element that we're doing a lot of work collectively to address at the moment. Obviously, when a property goes into void, dependent on how long the previous tenant has been in, there's works to bring it up to latest regulations, latest standards, which can take some time as well. Also, and it's not something that we kind of routinely do, but certainly it's an opportunity for us to invest in a property when it becomes void as well. There are kind of quite disruptive elements such as a full rewire of a property that if there's an opportunity for us to do that while the property's empty, it's a lot less disruptive than trying to do that around somebody. So kind of getting that balance between turning the property around as quickly as we possibly can and completing the work that either obviously is required or is sensible for us to do during that period is really important. I think the other thing that we do need to recognise is that kind of capacity within our service providers is something we've talked a lot about and is a real challenge. So making sure that we maximise the capacity of the available tradespeople to work in those properties has been a constant and remains a constant challenge, not just obviously in Leeds, but right across the sector. So there are kind of a few of the major variables that we see.
Can I just add in also that often if an applicant needs adaptations and they need those adaptations undertaken before they move into the home, then that often can take a delay, create a delay as well.
Thank you. I'm aware all members have had a go on voids, and I'm going to move on to repairs because I know that that's an area that members have got a keen interest in as well. Who would like to start on repairs? Councillor Rowntree?
Thank you, Chair. Yes. On the subject of repairs, I mean, I think this is something that many of us as councillors face in terms of casework, and keep coming back to. I have difficulty often getting to grips with, when we're talking about major repairs, getting to grips with the process and sort of understanding who's in control of this. If you sort of view it as a project, who is the project manager? Who's keeping everybody sort of keeping the plan together, ensuring that the right people talk to each other, that there's a sort of central record of where we are at any one time. And I know it's a frustration for householders as well. I mean, the sort of the classic stereotypical complaint that people will lay against councils everywhere is sort of Department A doesn't know what Department B is doing, and they don't talk to each other, that kind of stuff. I wonder if you could help us to understand, if you're saying talking about a substantial repair, perhaps perhaps say to major repairs to the roof of a freestanding house. What would be the sort of stages? Who would be in control? And if you just talk us through the process a bit, that'd be really helpful. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Councillor. And I think it's a really valid point that the number of kind of complex, high value repairs that we undertake has increased exponentially over the last kind of 5 years or so. Between property management, our repairs service, and strategy and investment, our investment service, we have traditionally operated as two distinct teams. Not to say that there's not discussion and collaboration between those two teams, but they have operated largely independently. Over the last 6 to 9 months, that's changed significantly, and we now are operating as one management team, one cohesive team, and seeing some real improvements in exactly the kind of example that you provided there. Batching large repairs and delivering those as a project. I think, again, what we've traditionally done is dealt with the kind of revenue spend, the repairs spend independently of the capital spend, the investment spend. Even if that's kind of a project, it's been dealt with as a repair. That's kind of not what the repairs service is set up to deliver. So we're now taking the approach of kind of irrespective of where that funding pot is, if it's a large scale project that needs delivering as a project, then the skills for that sit within our strategy and investment team. So just kind of putting square pegs in square holes and playing to the strengths of each of those services. And I think as a management team and delivering our service plan as a single team has really helped in that. Still work to do on that, and I'm sure you'll see that from the casework that you come across, Councillor. But some real improvements in process. What we tend to see, just coming to your specific question around process, what we tend to see obviously is areas of work either highlighted through our stock condition programs or indeed through that first point of contact as a customer reports that as a repair. That tends to come into the repairs team at the first point of contact. And invariably, when we're talking about complex repairs, an inspection will be undertaken by one of our technical officers. So what that would traditionally have done is fed into the repair service and will be delivered by our repairs service providers, be that Mears or Leeds Building Services. What we're now seeing for the more complex repairs is that being referred through to our capital teams who have those skill sets, who have that framework of service providers in order to deliver that more efficiently, both in terms of timescales and financially, to reach a conclusion more effectively. So I won't pretend that it's fully completed yet, but certainly as a process that there have been significant efficiencies identified, and hopefully you'll see that in your individual wards.
Thanks. If I could just follow up on that. Communication wise, are you confident that we're talking to the end users, our householders, in the right way and to a sufficient extent? I'm thinking particularly of a couple of cases I've had to deal with, and the people are saying to me, "I can't get any information out of the council." I think part of this, is that sort of over the last 20 years has been a sort of cultural shift away from the phone, and in days gone by, it was much easier to pick up the phone to the council and get somebody to get to speak to somebody who hopefully would know what was going on. But that's certainly more difficult. But it does seem to be a common theme that the person that you speak to when you ring the council, as you say, doesn't know what's going on. They don't have the information in front of them. Is there anything that we can do to do that better and make sure that whoever's out doing the work or specifying work leaves a central record that contact centres have access to, so they can advise people better? Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say from the feedback that we get from our customers that communication is a recurring theme on something that we do need to improve on, and we absolutely acknowledge that. I think the key thing for us, an area of improvement as far as that's concerned, is exactly as you articulate there, Councillor. That first point of contact, if not with the contact centre, then certainly with the repairs team, the asset team, at that first point of contact, to be able to provide information to our customers. I think what we have seen, again, traditionally is people being referred on to other teams, referred on to other providers, for example, and it's neither efficient nor is it the level of customer service that we want to deliver. So what we now have is our teams having access to the likes of LBS systems, to MEA systems, to be able to access that information at that first point of contact. Again, it's quite new in its application, so I'm sure there's still some smoothing to do in that process, but we are seeing those improvements in being able to provide that answer at the first point of contact. Now, that's obviously when we're receiving contact from a customer. The next step to that is that proactive communication with customers. So avoiding the need for customers to contact us because they know exactly what's happening. And again, improvements with both MEAs and LBS, and I'm sure Craig could add to this from the LBS side on just that communication about where we are in the process, appointments, when someone's en route, if that's not convenient, how we address that with customers about rearranging appointments. So that's again an ever evolving picture, but very recently some improvements put in place around those areas as well.
Councillor Khan.
Thank you, Chair. As you know, the ward I represent, it's got over 39 multi-storey and masonette blocks. And the biggest issue we are facing is the lifts in those multi-storey blocks that gets broken down on a regular basis. And one block we have a bit of problem now is the lift's been out for 2 months. And that is not acceptable for the residents who are paying services. And the lift, there's 2 lifts in that block. One is working, but what happens if it gets overused, it gets overheated, that gets broken down as well. And imagine if you got pushchair, bit of shopping with you, and you live on the 15-storey block, how would you feel? And if you just finish, say, 8 hours a shift you done at work, how would you feel? So I think my question is, we know those lifts in those multi-storey blocks, and we've got lots of multi-storey blocks in our city, across city, where they have lifts. There'll be similar lifts. Why do we keep those parts? Why does it have to be over 2 months for those parts to come and get those lifts repaired? Second one is on missed visits for repairs. People take time off work, and I know, and I've been emailing LBC as well, those appointments not being kept. Could you give us the figures? How many appointments not being kept, and what's the communication? How do we go back to those residents?
Yeah, thanks, councillor. So we'll talk about the lifts first, and I don't think that there's anyone around the table who would think that a lift being out for 2 months is acceptable. Least of all me, and I absolutely acknowledge that the impact that has on people's lives that you've described there. There are instances where lifts of this nature do have significant mechanical failures that do require us for us to replace major parts. There is obviously some consistency across a number of the assets around high turnover parts, indeed high value parts where we know there's long lead-in times, and we do have stock of those parts that mean that we can make that process a lot more efficient. Unfortunately, there are occasions, rare, but there are occasions where major parts do fail that are bespoke to those lifts, and we need to get those manufactured. Unfortunately, they're not kind of off-the-shelf parts. They do need manufacturing from scratch, and that obviously can take some time. It is rare, but we do absolutely accept the impact that has on families. We are investing, and have done for quite some time, significant values in our lift stock across the city. In excess of £2.5 million a year goes into lift replacements. Obviously, with the number of lifts and the number of high-rise blocks across the city, that is still restrictive at the pace at which we can replace lifts. We do, and we have reviewed our specification around how we're targeting that investment. So we've been doing obviously whole lift replacements in blocks for the last 7 to 9 years. We're now looking at, we are portioning off some of that investment to replace some of these high value parts that will give us a lot more reliability and a lot more time to get through that investment program. £2.5 million effectively buys us 4 high-rise lifts across the city, so generally 2 blocks a year. It's not the pace that we need to be working at, so we do operate on a kind of worst first approach, so looking at the reliability of the lifts, the age of the lifts, but it's not going at the pace that we need it to have an impact on the area that you talked about at the start there. So we are looking at some elemental investment in some of those lifts as well, which will accelerate the improvement. So it won't be whole lift replacements, but it will accelerate the investment in lifts across the city. Obviously, we deliver our lift maintenance and repair service through our internal service provider, which gives us a great benefit that we do have that service available 24 hours a day within the city. The response times meet all our requirements and expectations and targets. But like I say, unfortunately, we do sometimes come across those major components that do need bespoke manufacture. But that said, like that's not a justification for that particular lift that you referred to, councillor, being off for 2 months, but an explanation as to that specific example.
Can I come in now?
Sorry,
that was a very exhaustive explanation of our policy on lifts. I just wonder, is that kind of explanation offered to ward members when they have lift failure within their area? You don't have to answer that right now, though. You can let us know. I'm aware that Craig Simpson from Leeds Building Services hasn't had a chance to say anything yet, and it would be really useful to have your perspective on the issues that have been raised by members, and in particular, there was the reference from Councillor Tudor around housing managers and neighbourhood housing offices, and it'd be interesting to understand your understanding of the accountability of your service via these management offices.
Absolutely, yeah. Morning. I thought I'll take the opportunity just to give people a bit of an overview. In terms of housing managers, that's not within my remit. So my service... Sorry,
I didn't explain that well enough. When a housing manager has a complaint passed to them from a tenant, usually via a councillor, I have to say, it's their ability to get accountability from your service for the poor delivery of repairs. So I'm just trying to understand, in your services modus operandi, at what point does a red light flash if you get something from a housing manager, for instance? I'm just wondering if that's integral in how your service operates?
On and off. It is integral, yes. We have really close relationships with a lot of housing officers. So some of my staff attend those housing officers on a regular basis, or for drop-in sessions for councillors, customers to drop in and build those relationships. It's not perfect, but anything that we do get, we do treat with the utmost importance. We've got a complaints team, customer relations team within LBS that work very closely with teams across housing. So the idea there is there's an intervention team within housing that sort of try and deal with things at first point of contact. If things come into LBS, we deal with them at first point of contact. There's no passing around. We try and pick that up and deal with that issue straight away. We've also got a contact centre that sits within LBS as well to try and help with that. So customers chasing up repairs or inquiries can come directly to us to try and again avoid that situation of people getting passed around between departments. So we do that. On the point about the larger repairs and people taking ownership of those sorts of things, we've taken a similar approach in that we've got a plan section and then we've got a repairs and avoid section. There's some of the larger repairs always sort of sat between the two. So we've set up a dedicated team to actually pick those up now. So again, people that are more in tune with the sort of planned project approach, so they pick those types of works up. The idea there is that that will help with the communication and the overseeing of that job where it needs multiple visits, multiple trades, that sort of thing. So we have built that into our process already. In terms of communications, tenant communications, we're imminently going live with an on-way text. It's something that we do 24 hours before the appointment. We're about to switch on the on-way text to notify residents that we're on way. So that hopefully will make people aware that we are coming. We've done a lot of work with our planning team and scheduling around trying to improve that proactive customer contact to let them know we're coming ahead of time. So that's why we do the text. So appointments should be made, the text reminder should go, and then the final reminder would be when the tenant's en route. If an appointment gets rearranged or for whatever reason somebody phones in sick or we have to rearrange work, again, that is our priority to make sure that we notify the tenant at that point so that they're not sat in waiting. Yes, that might be disappointing that we've had to rearrange the appointment, but we need to be upfront with them, make that contact and make that call as early as possible. So that's in terms of our approach, really, in terms of that we're trying to build those relationships with housing officers, and hopefully some councillors in the room may have seen our staff out and about. It is something that we are going to do more of as well. So we want to expand that further.
I just clarify that when a text is sent, oftentimes when organisations use text, it's a broadcast and it basically says, this is information we think is important for you. But it doesn't offer an opportunity for the person getting that information to be able to contact back. And sometimes that's very important. How are you going to incorporate that into your new system?
I don't know the exact detail at this point, but I believe the first step is just a one-way. I think there are technical capabilities within the system to allow that around the appointments being amended potentially by residents, but that's not something that's in this plan. I don't believe that's something for a future opportunity. I think we need to explore a bit further. We just want to get this first step in, and then we'll look to enhance that within our capability.
I think Councillor Khan has a final question on this area before we move on to another part of the agenda.
Thank you, Chair. And just you need to answer about the missed repair visits. How many? Or do we keep a record? And the other one is just want to echo what you just said about the drop-in sessions in BRH. We're really thankful to Councillor Lennox and yourself and Adam for arranging a surgery on Friday morning, so residents can walk in if they've got any repairs issues. There's a LBC person sat with a laptop, and they can she can update them where the situation are, the repair. So that's really welcome. That you start doing that surgery in BRH. Thank you.
Councillor, if I may, just on the appointments kept statistic, we average across the city. Obviously, Craig can speak on behalf of Leeds Building Services, but not across the city when it comes to the repair stats. Average around about 85% appointments kept, which is not where it needs to be. That obviously means that we're not keeping 15% of the appointments kept. That again has improved significantly over the course of the last 12 months, around about a 6% improvement over the course of the last 12 months. So again, positive trajectory, but still not where it needs to be.
Thank you. Let's move on to the next section, which is damp, mold and condensation, which has been a very high priority area. And I know a lot of work has already happened on that. Do we have any questions from board members on this area? Councillor Stables.
I just wondered whether you can give us an idea of the process that's typically carried out and the time frame. So time frame it takes, and also how long from once when a request is made or a complaint is made to when it's actually resolved.
Yep, thank you, Councillor. We have a dedicated damp and mould team, so all reports of damp and mould are filtered through to the damp and mould team and triaged at that point of contact. So the idea is where we can either have pictures shared with customers, or can even do video calls. That provides us with the opportunity to triage the priority of that call. So obviously, dependent on what we're seeing from a severity perspective, or from the tenant's needs, any vulnerabilities, that priority will change, and allows us to make sure that we're targeting our resources where it's needed the most. Often, certainly where we're seeing high priorities, we'll get an inspection completed either the same day or the following day. With the lower priorities, that may take up to a week for us to get an inspection carried out, and from there, that then obviously allows us to assess the nature of that, any repairs required, and execute that accordingly. We do complete any emergency repairs within 24 hours, so that's from 24 hours from that point of contact. Again, the variables that allow us to assess whether it's emergency will be case by case specific. We take into account both the tenant's needs and, of course, the condition of the property. But that triage process has proved a real success for us, and making sure that we've got the skills within that team to make that positive assessment at that first point of contact. Mentioned earlier the feedback that we had from the Tenant Scrutiny Board and the work that we've done with the Tenant Scrutiny Board on communications and proactive communications around damp and mould, and the implementation of the recommendations from the Tenant Scrutiny Board. And again, that's had a real kind of positive impact as well. You'll be aware, Councillor, that just over 12 months ago now, there was the recommendations and the self-assessment from the Housing Ombudsman Service, all of which have been implemented within our own service now. So we are operating that model that is recognised as best practice. And again, we're seeing still relatively high levels of damp and mould, particularly at this time of year. But those proactive measures have really had a positive impact on that. In parallel to that, of course, we're working on the investment strategies to really have a proactive investment approach to dealing with damp and mould as well. Things like where we're looking at insulation, not forgetting about the ventilation requirements as well. There's no point insulating without ventilating. That's something that's incredibly important, and is something that again has been reflected in our specifications. So difficult to give you specifics on timescales other than to say emergencies are addressed within 24 hours. We do take the approach of addressing the hazard in the first instance. So where we see a prevalence of damp and mould, it is that mould that will represent a hazard to someone's health. So we'll deal with that deal with that mould within a 24-hour period. Where we have the root causes, that may take a little bit longer. So it may be, and again, this is something that we've discussed as a sector with the likes of DLUC and the Housing Ombudsman Service. It may be that where we have structural damp and mould, that we have to address that hazard on a number of occasions before we address that root cause. But I think being cognizant of the fact that it's the mould that will represent a health risk to people is something that we have a real focus on.
Thank you. just a follow up from that is that you talked about proactive communication. Can we see what that is in terms of recommendations? That would be really useful to see so that we can pass that on to residents.
Yeah, absolutely. We've relatively recently developed a number of videos, for example, that are now being approved and signed off again with the support of the Tenant Scrutiny Board. So yeah, we'll send you links to all of those.
Thank you. Moving on to, Councillor McCluskey.
Thank you, Chair. When a treatment's been applied for particularly mold, is there any sort of follow-up process afterwards to check that the treatment's worked?
Depending on the nature of the damp and mold, obviously condensation damp and mold is the highest cause that we see within damp and mold. So that's where that proactive communication and that intervention with the customer and that advice to a customer, and indeed support that we can offer around ventilating when cooking, for example, or drying clothes indoors is really important. Where we've treated damp and mold, we don't routinely have a follow-up. Obviously, reliant there on customers contacting us. It is something that's been discussed at length around how we have that feedback loop to make sure that what we've done is addressed that hazard that we've identified, but those repeat damp and mold is something that we are extremely mindful of and looking at further interventions. So yeah, that feedback loop is something that we are developing at the moment, but is not currently in the process when it comes to those kind of condensation damp and mold in particular, where it's treated, the advice is provided, and then the job completed.
Thank you. Moving on to asset management and investment. Any questions? Councillor Rowntree.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just a bit curious to know how we handle in the longer term freeholds. The reason I'm asking this question is I'm thinking about a particular property that was originally council owned and let to tenants. It's a large, probably Edwardian house split into two flats. The two flats have now been purchased under right to buy and sold subsequently. At least one of them has been sold to third parties. The council still owns the freehold and therefore responsibility for the roof. Now, I'm just wondering what your views are on whether this is sort of long term. Is this something that we should retain? Is there a way of disposing of it? Perhaps encouraging the leaseholders to jointly purchase the freehold. Are there any legal constraints on us doing this because it was originally a council property? What are your thoughts there? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor, and quite a hot topic for us at the moment. If I'm perfectly honest, there are a number of properties, particularly in the Georgian Victorian converted homes that have been made into flats, where we do have 100% leaseholders in there. But as you say, we retain the freehold and therefore retain the responsibility for the fabric of the building. I think there's work to be done, but I think we need to understand what our strategy is first, if I'm perfectly honest, around those areas. Certainly where the right of first refusal for buying back properties has expired, it is something that we need to consider what the best value approach is, both from a council perspective and for those leaseholders. There are some legal implications around leaseholders needing to form a company to manage that freehold, and I think there are a couple of examples where we've supported groups of leaseholders to do that, but I don't think there's really a fully developed strategy in place for how we do that consistently.
Thank you. When you say we need to understand our strategy is, that sounds like that's a sort of question for the political side. Okay, yep, thanks.
Mr. Moody, you wanted to come in on that item.
Sorry, Chair, I've got to leave the meeting to a prior engagement, but I want to thank you, Board, and I hope to see you at the next meeting.
And you'd be very welcome. Thank you. Councillor Siri.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just a quick one. We've got lots of pockets of land owned by the housing department that's just been left. So you know, cleaning neighbourhoods teams are having to go in there and clean them up. Do we have a plan of what, you know, these little pockets of land? I think they'll form a garage sites, and I don't know, to dispose of any or bring them back into use.
Yeah. Again, that's something that's kind of assessed on a case by case basis at the moment, particularly where we're demolishing a garage site, for example. Needs to be consideration then for what next. There's very little value to a site being levelled and then, as you say, kind of left to its own devices, as it were. So obviously work very closely with our council housing growth team to identify where there's opportunities for us to develop ourselves on parcels of land. But often these pieces of land are not kind of sufficiently sized to accommodate housing developments. So what other opportunities are there for that to be of value? There are, of course, examples where we work with third-party organisations who might want to turn them into to gardens or veg patches to support the initiatives that they work with. But I think again there is. I think it's fair to say more we could do to understand exactly where all these pieces of land are, particularly the small parcels of land that don't represent development opportunities. The larger pieces where, like I say, there's opportunities for either to develop ourselves or indeed dispose of that for development opportunities for commercial organisations. But I think it's the smaller pieces that present a larger problem, really.
So sorry, Chair. I've been asking for a number of years for a plan of the Pudsey ward with, you know, there must be about 20 different pockets of land. Some obviously are not big enough, but, you know, surely we should think about maybe turning it into the parks department instead of just, you know, fly tipping. That's all seems to be happening.
On that subject matter, I know that we do inspection of council housing areas that officers partake in, but I'm not aware that the environmental context of those properties is taken into consideration in terms of their surrounding environment, where they were purpose-built alongside those properties at some point by the council. And that environmental aspect does have an impact on people's lifestyles. So I just wondered if that could be incorporated into estate walkabouts. Just a comment. I'll bring in Councillor Hannan at that point.
Thank you very much, Chair. I think you've taken my question. I don't know how you did that. Well done. Especially around investment, I think there seems to be a lot of emphasis on properties, windows, damp, mold, and whatever. But there's also consideration needs to be taken. For instance, in the Howdens in Headingley High Park, it's in a secluded area where there's land, there's car parks, and there's like these plant pots that are quite depleted in recent times because of the weather, because of conditions. Can we look at investing in stuff like that enhances the community and enhances the housing neighborhood that people actually live in? And also, we've got car parks that are badly signed in terms of it should be really residents only, but people from adjacent areas come on park, and then that causes a knock-on effect in people with a disability that can't park the car near the house. Can that be considered going forward, please?
Thanks, Councillor. And I think speaking on behalf of both Mandy's side of the service and my own, we absolutely understand and see the importance and the value of place as well as just assets, and that's incredibly important to those individual communities. From an investment perspective, it's very difficult for us to target investment at those sort of areas, given the level of investment and the financial pressures on the service to invest in the assets to meet our legislative and health and safety standards. We do an awful lot of work through our service providers, both internal and external, looking at those social value opportunities that we have through contracts for things like community gardens and the planting that you talked about. So I think from a value for money perspective, that's where we try to address elements like that, and will continue to do so.
And if I can just add, I think the HRA land is considered as part of the estate walkabout, and if there are issues with rubbish being dumped, etc., then that would be picked up and responded to as part of the estate inspection. And then I suppose engagement with the tenant engagement team, picking up the point that Adam raised in terms of what opportunities can we do with the land, but with a limited budget capacity, that we are limited with the amount of investment that we can make.
Councillor Stables.
Thank you, Chair. This is moving on to the point about decarbonisation works that you've mentioned in point C. I just wondered if you could give us an update in terms of what is your decarbonisation project? What does that consist of? And I'm guessing that includes insulation. And if that's the case, what is the update on insulation? Because that's been a big bugbear in our area for we've got a number of properties which are built in the 1940s that are really not fit for purpose now in the Boston Spa area, where there is almost no insulation. So, in a cost of living crisis, the people that live there are really struggling to afford to heat the homes and are living in terrible conditions, actually, some of them. So just wondered if you can give us an update on that, please.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you, Councillor. You may recall, all of a sudden, it's a long time ago, back in 2020, we made the commitment that we'd invest £100 million in decarbonisation projects over the 5 years, 2020 to 2025. Lots of twos in there, sorry. I am pleased to say we're on track to exceed that target. Over £65 million worth of projects already delivered, another £40 million ongoing, and then there's our future development strategy for 24-25, which will continue a lot of that work. That has been focused predominantly around our district heating clusters and the Leeds Pipes projects. So working predominantly on some of the high-rise buildings. The reason for that being a lot of our energy performance worst performing buildings. So we've now completed 4 district heating clusters. We have both a combination of both air source and ground source heating that's improved the energy efficiency and as a result addressed the cost of living crisis for those customers fantastically, and has been a real success. In addition to that, we've completed a number of pilot schemes around places like the Holtdales in Holt Park, which was again a whole house improvement project on I think it was 150 flats in the Holt Park area, where we've again installed air source heating. Alongside of this is always the ventilation requirement, as you say, Councillor. I think what we're trying to do moving forward is expand the view of our insulation programs, not just looking at the high-rise blocks and indeed the flats, but equally how can we roll back a little bit on some of the domestic properties as well. We are, as part of our 24-25 programme, subject to internal governance, of course, been approving that programme, looking at some domestic insulation programmes to do some catching up on some of the domestic insulation programmes, but also wishing to continue with some of the kind of transformational stuff that we're doing with some of the high-rise blocks. We are looking at additional grant funding opportunities for some of this work. There's the Green Homes Fund, the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund, eco funding, so lots of funding streams about, but we need to make sure that we're in a position to exploit those, really, for want of a better term, when those opportunities come along. But like I said, we are kind of portioning the major projects from our if I can say, kind of routine, cyclical, repetitive works, such as Councillor mentioned earlier before, the kind of kitchens, windows, bathrooms, things like that, and we're kind of including our domestic insulation investment within kind of that envelope of investment as well.
Just coming back to the insulation, because I'm aware that there was an issue with the contractor. So the contractor we were using, for whatever reason, we were unable to use from, I think, March last year. So we've had now a whole year when we haven't had a contractor to put insulation into housing. Where are you with that? Because obviously you've lost a year now.
Yeah, we did on a short-term basis kind of plug that gap throughout the course of 23-24. It meant that we weren't able to do our insulation programs on the scale that we wanted to, but we were able to address kind of any high priority works through that. The procurement for replacement is ongoing, and we anticipate will be in place for early in the next financial year.
Right, thank you very much. I'm aware that we've taken a long time on this. However, I don't want to miss out an important area. So I know that we've done a lot on REMA, for instance, in previous meetings, and talking about the Building Safety Act compliance. Perhaps we might move on to homelessness. Do we have any questions from members on homelessness? Other than me? Okay. Councillor Anderson.
An excellent briefing, what day was it, 2 days ago, about the money that you've been giving out to Barca to try and take people off. And I think it's an indication of the good quality you're actually doing in terms of homelessness, especially when you compare, shall we say, comparable authorities that maybe shout a lot more, if I can put it nicely like that. So to congratulate you on the work that you're doing, it's not, look, there's still, as long as there's one person there, it's an issue. But the numbers that you've got, I think, are excellent. And, you know, personally, I'd like to thank you for the work that you've done.
However, we're not complacent. And one of the things that we've noted is that in January, we were told the figure in temporary accommodation was 93 families, and we're now in February, and that is now 195. Is this a trend that we think will continue at that pace?
Thank you. We have seen an increase in temporary accommodation, yes. It's 195 households, so that actually includes singles and family households. But we are seeing an increase per quarter of around 15 families per quarter, so that we are seeing a significant increase. We are doing lots of work around increasing our provision for both singles and families. So there are a number of projects that have enabled us to increase the number of properties that we can move singles and families into. But that said, the numbers are increasing. We have around 1,500 people contacting us every week as a service, and around 150 of those are asking for temporary accommodation. So that does sort of give you an idea of the numbers that are coming through to homelessness services. Despite the high numbers, we still have a fantastic prevention model, and we do take cases very, very early to make sure that we get the best possible opportunities to prevent homelessness in the first place. That model is always evolving. We're always looking at different ways in which we can support families and households to prevent homelessness. But yes, it is a challenge, and trends are going up in terms of the numbers that we are placing into temporary accommodation.
Thank you. Councillor Lennox wants to come in.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring something up that people may have, it's been a very busy week for us all, but people may have seen in the news that people are starting to discuss the Renters Reform Bill again. Now, the Renters Reform Bill came to Parliament last year, and one of the key parts of it was that it was due to ban Section 21 no-fault evictions. And at the last minute, it was rushed back in before the closure of Parliament last November, I think it was. And that bit was removed from the bill. And Mr. Gove told us that there would be crucial court reforms in order to enable the banning of no-fault evictions. The point is really there needs to be national legislation around Section 21 no-fault evictions, because the numbers of people who every member here will have there'll be numbers of people in their inboxes who actually out of the blue their landlords now are turning around, and it's to do with mortgage rates for landlords, and it's to do with the fact that landlords are selling up to keep to cover their own costs or putting rents up. But people who are families who've lived in these in some cases in properties for a number of years with no issues with their tenancies or with their landlords, and the landlords are turning around to them and saying, I'm sorry, I've got to sell up, and actually I can do it, you have to be out. Now, I wrote last year to Michael Gove about this, and they received a reply when they did put the first part of the bill through. There is a lot of work to be done on this. It's been promised that it will happen before the next general election. I'm planning to write again to Michael Gove with the same points that I made last time about why Section 21 evictions are causing chaos for families, causing chaos for teams like Kerry's, people going from having what they thought was stable housing for a number of years with enough bedrooms for their kids, etc., and it's gone. So just to point out that until we have a ban on Section 21 evictions, which has been promised, we're going to see increasing numbers of families needing housing options support and temporary accommodation.
Thank you, Councillor Lennox. I believe you anticipated a question from Councillor McCluskey. And Councillor Khan, you indicated you want to speak, but this will be the final comment on this paper. Any further questions we can submit in a written format for answers for scrutiny members. Councillor Khan.
Thank you, Chair. My final question is, we do rehouse people with complex needs, and when those people are getting rehoused, they get spot them through the rehousing. Once they have been allocated a house or been rehoused, and they don't take that spot, where do we stand? Where does the tenancy stand with those with complex needed people?
We offer support, but legally we can't make people comply with support. So support cannot be a condition of tenancy. And so we work with the tenant as much as we possibly can. Many of the tenants have got support agencies or social workers, and we do everything that we can in terms of working with those support workers to ensure that any support is connected with the various agencies, but ultimately we're not able to make it a condition of tenancy. Do you want to add in?
It might just be worth me coming in to say one of the, we've recognised this, and one of the bids that we've been really successful in recently, which is called SHAP, is specifically for people who have really complicated needs, people who don't tend to manage well in tenancies, whether that's sort of social housing or private rented. And the SHAP model is all around supporting those people with wraparound support, which is sort of very people will take the support, they'll lose the support, they'll take the support. That's the whole sort of model of SHAP, and there's going to be a number of properties in the city that are going to support people with really high complex needs.
Thank you. Yes, we've identified the resident has got complex need and we want to rehouse them. How do we assess those? Where do we give them housing? Do we give them a housing where we have already people with complex need? That's going to be causing a lot of nuisance and a lot of upsets. where we've got sustainable community living there? How do we assess? How do we rehouse those people with complex needs then?
I think we'd always try and look at it on a case by case basis. So if you did have particular cases that you wanted to send to me, I could have a look at them. And then I think we would just have to always look at them as individuals and look at what we've done so far, what's worked, what hasn't, and then come up with a plan.
Thank you. Good point to end on there. As your department looks after so many individual cases that have big impacts on people's lives, and thank you for coming to talk to us about how you deliver that today. We're going to move on to our next item, which is ensuring the resilience of the third sector in Leeds. I believe, this is before my time on the scrutiny board, that there was an understanding that recognising the role that the third sector had during the pandemic, and the fact that that period created just as much disturbance amongst the third sector as it did anywhere else, but it highlighted the value of the third sector in terms of community sustainability, that we would be checking in every now and again to make sure that the third sector in the city was being supported by the council's strategies, and that we could work together to make it even better. So on that note, I note that Councillor Harland is here. She's been waiting very patiently throughout the entire meeting, which we do appreciate. And James Rogers. We've got Nadeem Siddiqui. Have we?
No, we haven't.
He's not. No, they're not here.
Liz.
We've got Liz and we've got Paul. We haven't got Kim Groves, I see. No. But we do have Hannah Bailey, we do have Pip Goff, and Megan Russell. No. Okay, sorry, that's people on my list. Therefore, it's an opportunity for people to introduce themselves who haven't been mentioned so far.
I think that would be me, Councillor Colton. I'm Samantha Powell. I'm the Third Sector and Migration Partnership Manager, working under Nadeem and Paul, so supporting the work to support the third sector.
Thank you, Samantha. Is this your first time at Scrutiny Board?
No.
We usually just check to see how gentle we need to be, but no, we'll be robust. Councillor Harland, would you like to introduce the item?
Thank you, Chair. And it's been a pleasure to listen to the housing item as well. I think members realise and recognise the impact that the third sector, our very diverse and wonderful third sector, contribute to our communities in the city. And we continue to invest in that, but we all realise that we're asking to do more with less, as is the council. But I'm sure that members will wait to hear from Sam, Hannah and Pip, who have been the authors of this report. Thank you. Excuse me.
Okay, shall we go straight through to our partners then? Pip, let's start with you.
Oh, thank you. I mean, I'm hoping everybody's had a chance to read the report, which Sam incredibly helpfully pulled together, really collaboratively, actually. It was really brilliant that it was such a kind of joint effort pulling that together. I mean, I don't know how you want us to do this, whether you want a bit of a summary of some of the points in it or some of the things that have changed since. I mean, it's a fast moving landscape. But
if you could just give us an introduction, that'd be great, and then we'll come in with questions afterwards.
Brilliant. I mean, I suppose what I would say, and then I might hand over to Sam, maybe to give a bit of an introduction to the content of it. But I think it's really important that we note just the sort of value of, we've seen, and you've mentioned in COVID, we've seen the value of the third sector. And I think as a local authority, we see, great level of support and recognition of the value of the third sector. But there are huge challenges, I think, particularly around you know, the multiple cost pressures that organisations are having to face, the way in which organisations are having to subsidise, in effect, a lot of the local authority and health provision. So I think it's about how do we sort of shift into that sort of being our new normal, really, and thinking how we work more collaboratively going forward and make sure that we're putting the actions that we talk about doing, you know, right through into all of our behaviours and culture in how we're working. I mean, I have got more detail about some of the kind of cost pressures, but perhaps if I hand over to Sam or Hannah.
You wanted to come in, Paul, did you?
I was about to, Councillor Galton, but I would defer to Hannah in the first instance, if that's fine with you, Hannah. I know you was just to come in then.
So polite. Yeah, I guess just to build on and echo Pip's comments. I mean, I think the picture in Leeds in terms of the pressure on the third sector does mirror what's happening nationally. So, you know, we're no different to that national picture. I think what is different in Leeds is the value that public sector partners place on those relationships with the third sector, and the vibrancy that that brings to the city. There is, as Pip's alluded to, that, you know, real kind of dual impact of the cost of living pressures on the sector in terms of the communities that organisations are working with, but then the impact in terms of cost pressures on organisations themselves, which is very real and continuing. Obviously, the report updates that since we last came to scrutiny, there have been a number of developments in terms of including the publication of the State of the Sector report and the third sector strategy. And again, there's no doubt of the city's strategic commitment to ensuring the resilience of the third sector. I think it is just ensuring, and the work we do with council colleagues is keeping this on the agenda and everyone's very live to it, but making sure that, you know, within a large institution such as the local authority, but also within health, that actually those stated strategic commitments actually play out at, you know, directorate and departmental level as well. And, you know, we know that the cost pressures and the financial pressures that public sector partners find themselves under are likely to be enduring. So I think, you know, we are in a good position in Leeds with the vibrancy of the third sector in terms of thinking about, you know, a reduced role for local government and what that means in terms of the role of the third sector and also the role of the third sector in terms of their relationship with communities and thinking about, you know, reshaping the way that we work with communities in the city. So I think, you know, it is a challenging picture, but there are some real opportunities for, you know, bold and creative thinking. So that's, yeah, just my kind of opening thoughts.
Okay, I'll open up to questions then. Members, who'd like to start off? Councillor Hannon.
Thank you very much, Chair, and a big thank you to Councillor Harland for taking this massive project for the city. Having worked in the third sector, I think we're the fourth emergency services for the city. If you remember, during COVID, the third sector was the people that took a lead on dealing with COVID. And moving on to that, we're dealing with cost of living, which is probably an ongoing issue that, well, nobody knows when the end is and nobody knows when this is going to end. I welcome this report. It's fantastic that there's recognition and acknowledgement in terms of how the third sector is serving minority people, vulnerable people, young people, and especially vulnerable communities. I'm keen to know, there's some discussions on this, but I'm keen to know what's the strategy in terms of strengthening the third sector going forward? I think that's something that we need to probably look at and invest. And I think there's key partners in this room now that can make that work. So the question is, what is the strategy in terms of strengthening the third sector? Thank you.
Who would like to come in first? Hannah.
Yeah, thank you. So included at Appendix 4 is a summary of the third sector strategy, which has been developed over the last year or so. And I think what's really positive about this strategy, it isn't something that we in the third sector went away and developed sort of in isolation as a sector. It was very much developed in partnership with a range of partners across the city. And it sets out, you know, some really key ambitions in terms of the support that is provided in the city, and that the onus is not just on the third sector to focus on some of these kind of key ambitions, but for statutory partners to also support taking that work forward. So the strategy was launched back in the autumn, in October, and third sector partnership, which meets regularly and brings together third sector, public sector, some of the universities, health, you know, range of partners around the table. They're going to be the accountable body for kind of overseeing the rollout of the strategy over the coming years. So for the next year, we, as part of the launch of the strategy, we took it out sort of locally to different parts of the city to talk to third sector groups and organisations within communities about what their priorities were. And we got a clear steer that the priorities were around commissioning, social value and partnerships. So that's where we're going to be putting our emphasis in the first year. And third sector Leeds, which is the third sector sort of network of networks in the city, are currently drawing together a work plan around how we actually take some of those key areas of work forward. But I think, yeah, the key thing to emphasise is this is not a third sector strategy. It's a strategy to ensure the resilience of the third sector that a wide range of partners have had a key role in developing and will play a key role in taking forward. So I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that, Pip.
I mean, other than to say, you know, we've also been trying to have very live and current information. So the state of the sector report, and also we've done reports around cost pressures. So we're trying to make sure that we're kind of keeping that kind of very live and current, and raising the risks and challenges. Particularly, people will be aware in terms of some of the NHS funding is a significant concern at the moment. So trying to use the strategy to link in health partners as well as the local authority, and also to make sure that we're, you know, actually, you know, as we've said before, translating the good intentions into practical different ways of doing things. And I think, you know, like so much of the third sector work, quite often things rely on people going over and above, or people doing things on comparatively short-term pieces of funding and work. So anything that we could do collectively to ensure the longer-term funding and sustainability, longer contracts, and sort of making sure that we're doing that forward planning. But I don't know, Sam, you might want to come in.
Can I make a suggestion, for instance? It sounds, one of the things that stood out to me as a chair, I have to say, is that this paper was in a completely different format to what we usually get in terms of our reports. And that demonstrated to me that it was the third sector themselves that were involved in its production and how it talked to us. Our frustration as a scrutiny board is that we can only take a snapshot every now and again on any particular area. And we need to have assurance that the good work which is happening is consistently being delivered. And we can offer challenge at good points in the process. So we usually have performance management, for instance, in Scrutiny Board, where we look at the council's KPIs, which indicate that it's doing well in certain areas. Now, I don't think that the council actually has any KPIs which look at regulating and measuring the health of the third sector in the city as key partners to deliver some of the council's strategic goals. So I wonder if we could develop those based on what's in this paper. So I know that there are certain tensions in here, for instance, around the number of volunteers is going backwards. Now, that's a serious issue if the third sector depends upon the, volunteer work. How could we as a council help to support that to improve? Areas around, you also mentioned difficult conversations that there need to be with council, usually around commissioning, or for instance around community asset transfers, that kind of thing, where we have community assets which aren't just human assets, they're also physical assets which do have a value. So it would be useful, I think, to understand those tensions in those areas and how we can measure that we're actually doing well in them. That's just a suggestion. Any comments? Paul?
Councillor, can I suggest that I think is a really good idea in terms of, I think the ambition here is to continue to work in the manner that Pip and Hannah have detailed, work together, and that co-production and that co-working. I think in terms of the challenges that we see in the kind of immediate and medium term future, which is kind of detailed in the report, but they are not insignificant. I think the opportunity to work with Scrutiny in the way that you've kind of identified there, and maybe to think about even at a more granular level, because there is something, for instance, as you've said, about volunteering. There's something about the number of organisations within the sector and how that's changed in recent years. There's information in there about how we're working together on the priorities. But I think, if I may say so, that kind of exploration of where are the opportunities to really keep a regular eye on the health check of the sector moving forwards with colleagues in the sector is really the way we need to go, I think. Thank you.
Anybody else from the board? Hannah?
Yeah, I suppose just on that point around kind of KPIs and whether it's kind of helpful to think about developing some around kind of the third sector. I suppose my initial response is that that may be helpful, but it's also such a kind of complex and nuanced sort of picture that I'm struggling to know whether it would definitely add value. So I think it's worth exploring further. I suppose it's also useful to reflect that the public sector have got, a role to play, an absolute definite role to play in terms of the health and resilience of the third sector. But that's not solely through commissioning and grants. It is about creating the right conditions to enable, smaller groups coming together within neighbourhoods and communities to be able to get on with what they want to get on with locally. And so I think it's that kind of very, rich and diverse picture of the sector in the city. And we know from the state of the sector findings, although the number of organisations has gone down, that we've still got 3,200 groups and organisations, across the city. So, it's a hugely vibrant and diverse sector. And there are those kind of two elements to it that, I always say third sector is everything from multi-million-pound turnover, big organisations, right down to a couple of people coming together in a community to do good, and everything in between. So it's just, I think it'd be interesting to explore whether there are KPIs that could meaningfully really sort of chart the council's sort of progress and commitment around this. I don't know if you've got anything you want to add around that, Pip.
Yeah, no, thank you, Hannah. It is difficult, isn't it? I think some of this is about some of the other conversations that I know communities and other parts of the local authority have had about how different parts of the local authority interact with the third sector and making sure that that is really joined up. Sometimes that, is about shifting some of the power and doing things more collaboratively, doing things with communities and organisations. So I think, I kind of understand why kind of KPIs might seem sort of a valuable thing. But I mean, hopefully what you saw in this paper, which I think was brilliantly pulled together by Sam, and obviously we did all contribute, was that it was very accessible and a narrative that actually shows that quite difference in working collaboratively. And I think that's the thing that we need to build on. And that's the thing that we need to make sure that we're seeing just how much the sector brings to the city, and that we're, you know, kind of really shouting about that, and kind of, you know, that's, I think, genuinely, compared to other places in the country, even other places in West Yorkshire, you know, we've got such a lot to celebrate, but we need to protect, and we can always do more and make sure we're doing better. But you know, I think this is exactly an example of the collaborative working that is gaining traction already. So I think we should kind of hold our nerve with this approach personally.
Councillor Rowntree.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just thinking of what you were telling us a few moments ago, Hannah, and you mentioned creating conditions in which the third sector can flourish. I wonder there if this is about cutting red tape, and whether there is anything we can do here. I mean, I think it's in the nature of local authorities. There is always going to be a level of red tape, and there are regulations that we're obliged to follow, and legal duties placed upon us that can't be avoided. But if it is that kind of thing to make it easier for very small operations, or even down to one-person bands, I think, as you reference in the report there, that things that the council could do to make third sector operations easier. Do you have a couple of things in mind? Any examples? Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think that issue of land. So, Councillor Galton, you referenced community asset transfer. That's an area at the minute that we're through the Leeds Community Anchor Network, particularly, although also working with other groups and organisations, thinking about the financial position of the council currently, and how we can ensure that the insight and knowledge from third sector within their communities can be collaboratively shared to enable the council to make good decisions around assets within neighbourhoods that, you know, may be suitable for community asset transfer. Also, on the issue of land, colleagues from the University of Leeds and Hyde Park Source are involved in a project at the minute, a research project around sort of, you know, pieces of land in the city, and where there's appetite from communities to kind of come together and make use of that land. What are some of the barriers currently? And that's about trying to take the view of bringing, you know, all those voices and experiences together, and recognising, you know, the council's legal duties and some of the constraints that the council is operating, you know, under and around, but also that experience of communities. And can those shared experiences come together in terms of developing solutions that therefore mean that communities are more able to take action, you know, on those pieces of land. So there are a couple of very live examples which feel really relevant at the moment.
Pip.
Thank you. I think there's also something quite important about procurement and commissioning, and how we do some of those things, which aren't necessarily about red tape, but they're about making sure that we think about the big picture. You know, we sometimes have commissioning processes, don't we, which don't necessarily value the local organisations and build on the local assets that we've got, and can just look at a kind of financial bottom line, which misses the huge added value that third sector organisations can bring, and that, you know, by being rooted in the city can bring, you know. And sometimes we do see big national providers kind of winning contracts. So I think there's also something about having a really honest and open conversation about some of those, you know, they're difficult areas. They are difficult conversations to have, but I think, you know, we have to really think about the value of the Leeds pound and what all of that means kind of through the different processes.
Councillor Stables.
I'm obviously very aware that one of the issues and concerns is just having enough money for a lot of these organisations to keep going. And I wondered whether there exists currently, there may well be, is there someone that manages a database on the various grants that are available that communities can tap into, organisations can tap into?
Yes. So Voluntary Action Leeds works with Leeds City Council on the Funding Leeds platform. So that's where groups and organisations can access up-to-date information around various sources of grant funding. That's also complemented by the Leeds Funding Support Network, which is run in the city. We also do a number of Meet the Funder events every year where groups and organisations can come along before applying to a funder and find out more and ask questions and hopefully put themselves in the best position for submitting a successful grant application.
Before I bring you back in, Pip, on that issue of grants, one of the key areas that councillors can get involved with voluntary organisations in terms of financing sometimes is community committees. We're currently going through a community committee review. Liz, can you spell out what we're doing to involve the third sector in shaping what comes out?
Well, at the moment, we're speaking to Hannah about how best to engage the third sector and as part of the review, both in terms of how we engage with them as we're coming to our recommendations in terms of the review, and more importantly, how we engage with the third sector once review recommendations have been made, and how we engage the third sector much more effectively in those meetings. So Hannah and I have met a couple of times now, and it is something that's a bit of an ongoing conversation at this moment, but it's certainly on the agenda, Councillor Galton.
Pip.
Yeah, just briefly coming back. I mean, funding is really, really important, and people don't do it for the money, but they need money to do a lot of the work that the third sector does. But it is only part of the picture. We've been working around workforce and generous leadership, trying to make sure that some of the larger organisations are sharing resources and information. We've got some brilliant workforce resources that we can share with some of the really tiny organisations. So, and lots of ways in which Voluntary Action Leeds and collectively across our kind of third sector infrastructure support, we try and make sure that we're sharing kind of confidence and support. And I think there isn't going to be more money at the moment, is there? Obviously, we can think how we spend the money we have, and I think there's definitely questions that we should all be asking about where we're investing and where the best cost benefit and all of that is across all of the services and provision we have in the city, but not to underestimate the importance of relationships and support and reaching out and offering, particularly, your colleague mentioned around culturally diverse and young people. And, there are so many people whose experiences are even more difficult at the moment. So it's that reaching out point, which I think's just as important in terms of what we can practically do at the moment. Hopefully the finances will get better at some point in the future, but they're not about to, I don't think.
Hannah.
Yeah, I think just to add to that as well, as Pip's outlined, I think it's really shifted since COVID, that sense within the third sector of supporting one another and organisations working together, and that emphasis on collaboration, not competition. I think, in the space of a few years, we are in a very different environment, a much more positive environment, which is necessary given the, very challenging financial environment that we all find ourselves in. But that support between organisations is stronger, I think, than it's ever been.
Thank you. You mentioned the Community Anchor Network as one of the legacies of coming out of COVID, and the value of enablement and consultation in localities. One of the complaints that we often get as councillors from people who do want to do stuff within their community is the problem that they have with bureaucracy and what they have to do to access, for instance, some MICE money in terms of being a constituted organisation. And a lot of our tenants and residents associations have depleted because of that expectation on individuals in terms of bureaucracy. Is the Community Anchor Network going to do something to lighten that load?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the key roles of a community anchor within their locality is to provide support to that local ecosystem of groups, organisations and individuals. So it's not about kind of one organisation, it is about that kind of network, and it is about ensuring that within communities where people are wanting to come together and undertake social action, that they've got support either from that community anchor or another organisation or group that already exists to enable them to do that. So yeah, that's absolutely the intention. You know, the anchor network, we've now got full coverage across the whole city. Different anchors are at different stages of development. So we've got some areas that are really, really forging ahead, got a very vibrant local ecosystem of groups and organisations regularly coming together. Others, you know, at an earlier point of their development, but all providing support to one another sort of citywide through the main network meetings. But yeah, again, going back to my earlier point around that emphasis on collaboration, not competition, we're seeing that, you know, through the community anchor network, through the neighbourhood networks, and making those connections between the various networks that exist within the city and particularly within the third sector.
Pip.
Yeah. Just very briefly, we've been able to use some West Yorkshire funding actually that we had, Power of Communities, which a number of you I hope will have heard of. And we've invested that through the Community Anchor Network and also the Culturally Diverse Hub to try and improve resilience and capacity in frontline organisations. So we're trying to work in that way as well to make sure that, you know, we're sort of the resources are trickling down, I suppose, and reaching the organisations who need them. So yeah, just important, I think, to recognise the value of that kind of work, which again would be great if it could have ongoing funding, but we'll find sources, I'm sure.
That's a very interesting line of inquiry. It came up at yesterday's budget meeting in terms of making sure that there's coterminosity in terms of funding from the West Yorkshire level as in terms of what happens locally here. So it'll be interesting for you to know how you're getting on in terms of, what's the word, highlighting the needs of place within an organisation which has a much wider footprint than a local authority. That'd be very useful to feed back to us next time we meet. Any other questions from members? Well, in that case, I think we're concluded. Thank you very much. And on behalf of all the members here, thank you very much for all of the work that you do. And please do continue to feed back to us outside of meetings if you think there's an area that you think the Scrutiny Board should spend some time scrutinising that's pertinent to your area of work. Thank you. And thank you. We'll go on to the next item, which is the work programme. Becky, are you able to update us in between coughs?
Yeah, apologies, Chair. Members are just asked to note the draft work programme for your last meeting next month, and to also just be reminded that you have a remote working group taking place on the 2nd of April regarding the regulation of social landlords.
All right, with that, any other business? No, I declare the meeting closed. Thank you very much for your attendance. And your attention, considering you had all day yesterday at budget.